last year, when I came to give a talk for the Friedman Day event, we talked mostly about the threats to freedom that come from the traditional public school system and the kind of local monopoly that it creates. But I have to tell you that while those threats to liberty continue to exist and must be addressed, that there is a different threat to liberty, and it comes from reformers trying to fix that system. So there's a danger that reformers can undermine liberty just as much as the system they're trying to reform. And so it reminds me a little bit of the movie Viva Zapata, which is a little bit old, and I apologize if people haven't seen it, but I give you the very lurid poster. It was a John Steinbeck screenplay. Elia Kazan directed. Marlon Brando was in it as the title character. Anthony Quinn won a supporting Oscar. And the plot, which is a fictionalized account of the Mexican Revolutionary Zapata, has this group of peasants that come to the dictator to complain about confiscation of their land. And the dictator dismisses them, including Zapata, who then joins up with revolutionaries. They unseat the dictator. Zapata is installed as the new dictator. A group of revolutionaries a group of peasants come to complain about confiscation of their land to him, and he dismisses them just as the dictator had before. And this is just a wonderful story of how there's a danger when you are a reformer of becoming the very thing that you're trying to correct. And the reform movement needs to think about this and be aware of those dangers within its own movement. And so that's why I think this is a little bit like the movie Viva Zapata. So there are really kind of two main theories that are housed within the reform movement. And I've tried to articulate what the two theories are here. But one theory, which it goes by the acronym PLDD, which stands for Petty Little Dictator Disorder. It's actually a condition that is under consideration for inclusion in the DSM-6. So be on the lookout for psychologists writing prescriptions to address PLDD. So there's a petty little dictator disorder theory. And that theory basically is that the problem with the system of education is that they're doing the wrong things. And that if only we could get them to do the right things, which are the things that I think are the right things, and that my friends think are the right things, if only we were in charge and made the system do the right things, it would be better. Okay? Which feels a little bit like Viva Zapata, right? Let's unseat this dictator and install a better dictator. The other theory is the liberty theory, which is that it can actually, you can support this in one of two ways. You could either say there is no such thing as the right way, that there are actually many possible right ways in many different circumstances, or even if you do believe that there is a right way on some issue within education, you might not have confidence that whoever would be in charge as dictator would be likely to pursue that right way over time. And so either because there is no right way, or because the right way cannot be reliably enforced through a new dictator, then we have to decentralize control, allow people to make decisions for themselves, experience the consequences of those decisions, and as a result, discover the right ways for them by making their own choices and experiencing the consequences of their own actions. And these two different theories are both housed within the reform movement. There are people who believe both of these theories who call themselves reformers. And there are people who actually have a little bit of both of these theories within them. I mean, people can be logically inconsistent or have tensions within their thoughts without having to resolve them. And many people do. So you'll hear a lot of people say, yes, I like choice and competition, but we really need to make schools do this thing, right? So some people can have a little bit of both there. And I'm here today to describe to you some examples of this PLDD, petty little dictator disorder theory, and how I think those issues pose threats to liberty, and how lovers of liberty need to do something to address those movements, those threats to liberty that come from within their own reform movement. So let's first talk about Common Core. And I know that this has become a little bit of an issue in Georgia. And let me first describe to you practical objections to Common Core that are not liberty-based. So these are problems with Common Core that don't stem from the threat of that Common Core poses to liberty. So one problem with Common Core is that there's no reason to believe that if a state improves its standards, somehow defined, that it will have better results. This has been analyzed by several different studies. Most prominently, Tom Lovelace has examined this. And if you use something like the Fordham Institute's rating of state standards, or even changes in state standards, and look at student achievement on something like the National Assessment of Educational Progress, there's no relationship, none. No relationship between the rigor of standards according to prominent rankings of those standards and how well students do. And there's even no relationship between those standards and how well students progress. And change in their achievement on these tests are not related in any way. I mean, the correlations are really close to zero. And why might that be? It's not that in principle, there's no relationship between what we expect students to learn and how well they should perform. It's just that the standards as a practical matter don't actually force anyone to do anything. You can think of standards as words in a document, right? They are these goals, often very vague goals, of what students are supposed to learn in a document, but they don't make anyone do anything. So you can change what the goals are that you write in a document, but school districts and schools and teachers in their classrooms can shut their door and do whatever they want. And changing the standards doesn't change what happens in the classroom. And so, not surprisingly, it doesn't result in any change in achievement, and that's why there's no relationship. These are simply vague statements of goals. Now, in principle, you could have a change in standards attached to a change in performance, but to do that would require changing lots of things. So you'd have to change the standards, but then you would have to change the assessments, the tests that are aligned with those standards, and then you'd have to attach consequences to the results of those tests to force school districts, schools, and teachers to change what they do, okay? And that is ultimately the dream of standards-based reform. The dream of standards-based reform is that we'll not only change the words in the document, but we're going to attach it to assessments, which will be then change curriculum, which will then change pedagogy in the classroom. Right? It'll change what is taught and how it is taught in the classroom, and the only way to do that is to attach consequences to individual teachers and schools to those vague words in the document, to the standards. Not surprisingly, this is extremely unlikely to happen. The probability that you will get states all over the nation to agree to not only adopt the vague words. Adopting the vague words was costless and had a benefit to it, to states. If they adopted Common Core, they had a chance at getting money from the federal government in the midst of a fiscal crisis, so they were tempted, and they were offered regulatory relief to No Child Left Behind regulations that they felt they could not meet. And so the combination of regulatory relief and the prospect of getting money in the midst of a fiscal crisis lured many states into adopting Common Core standards, but adopting was an empty gesture, right? You just swear you're gonna adopt these vague words in a document. But to have them be real, you have to have the system agree to adopt new assessments. Those new assessments have to be aligned with those standards, and they have to have real consequences for individual school district schools and teachers. This is not going to happen. It will fail. And the reason why it will fail is because the people who are in charge of it won't let it happen, right? It's extremely unlikely that the people who are the most politically influential in the education system, the people involved in the education system, are going to squeeze advice on themselves. They're not likely to be relied on to do that, since it would make their own lives more unpleasant. And so, not surprisingly, the teacher unions were on board with Common Core when it was just a bunch of vague words, but now that people are starting to talk about assessments, Randy Weingarten has come out and said, let's have a halt on any high-stakes testing related to the new Common Core standards. This is not surprising at all. It's all perfectly predictable. Right? She was all for it when it was empty words in the document. When it's something that might actually impose consequences, she's against it. And by the way, she has a lot more power than most people involved in education, and they'll block it. They'll stop it in most states. They're very good at that. But it's not just them. Everyone else is going to wake up to the reality that Common Core is going to drive a change in their school district or their school, and they, for each of their own reasons, will try to block it too. So all of the ambiguity that is maintained about what Common Core really requires, what it really means, whether it is more progressive education or more classical education, all these ambiguities get resolved as it actually gets implemented. And as those ambiguities get resolved, the people whose interests are hurt begin to discover who they are and oppose it and block it. So for all these reasons, it is inevitable that Common Core will fail. It will fail to actually change practice in classrooms all over the country. It will fail to do that. It may stay on the books and be the standards of various states, but it will be the same vague, empty words in a document as the standards before them. Because it's a political bridge too far to try to squeeze this whole system down to classroom level through assessments and consequences. Everyone whose interest will be hurt will figure out who they are, and they will oppose it. Now, of course, the inevitable only happens if everyone who's supposed to oppose it does what they're supposed to do. So the inevitable is contingent upon people acting on their interests, but I have confidence, as Milton Friedman did, that people will pursue their interests, that similarly, people who oppose Common Core will pursue their interests and block it. Actually, I skipped the second explanation here, which is that, so Common Core is a bad idea because first, there's no reason to believe that there's a connection between standards and achievement, and second, because it's almost certain to be a political failure. But I should also say that a lot of the rhetoric that's used to support Common Core makes no practical sense either. So, for example, there are claims that it's good to have it be common because it achieves economies of scale and improves information. So if everyone in the country were to have the same standards and the same assessments, the assessments would be cheaper because you could do it on scale rather than each state having to develop its own. You could do it nationally, it should be cheaper that way. And it should improve information because people can share information, make everything comparable by having the same standards and the same assessments. Neither of these benefits will be realized. First, I think as George is beginning to discover, the new assessments will cost a lot more. There is no such thing as economy of scale in education. There are actually pretty clear diseconomies of scale in most aspects of education. And that's a whole nother conversation for why that is, but part of it is the political nature of the enterprise. It makes it so that the costs actually are spiraling out of control. So the new test is actually going to be a lot more expensive. And information comparability, frankly, we already have information comparability. from state to state, even though states have different tests, because we have a national test called the NAEP, which provides us information as NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, which allows us to know how every state is doing and make comparisons. And in fact, you can even use the NAEP to equate local school district tests from place to place and put them on the same scale already. And I've actually already done that in something called the Global Report Card, which I did with the Bush Institute. If you look up Global Report Card, you could look up your school district and you can see how that district does relative to every other school district in the United States and relative to actually 25 countries abroad. We already have information to compare students from place to place in the country, and we're seeing no economies of scale in the testing or other issues related to Common Core. But more importantly are the liberty objections to Common Core, which is Common Core is not just bad because it's going to fail politically. It's bad because it's a threat to liberty. And it's a threat to liberty because implicit in it is a belief that there is a correct way for all students to learn. That there is a set of knowledge that all students must possess, that Common Core knows what that knowledge is, and if standards drive curriculum, which drives pedagogy and drives everything that happens in the classroom, what we're talking about is imposing a remarkable amount of uniformity on all of our school children. And that's a threat to liberty because, as it turns out, we don't all agree on what it is that all of our children are supposed to learn or how they're supposed to learn it. And part of freedom is having the ability to disagree about these fundamental issues like what knowledge is essential, and to disagree about what practices are most effective at communicating knowledge. And having that freedom to disagree and to pursue our different visions is the same kind of essential freedom we have in any other aspect of our life, the same kind of liberty we have about who to vote for, right? I mean, why isn't there just a correct answer for what the right policies are and why and who the politicians are that pursue those correct policies? Imposing uniformity in who we vote for would be as much of an infringement on liberty as imposing on all school children what it is that they're supposed to learn and how they're supposed to learn it. So there is an illiberal core to Common Core. And so if it were to succeed somehow, it would be bad. I take comfort from my confidence that it will fail, but it only fails if everyone does what they're supposed to do. So you all have to do what you're supposed to do. But there are negative consequences to liberty even if Common Core fails, or even when Common Core fails, which is that it has changed the political scene around education by expanding the power of the federal government. And it's a one-way ratchet. So when the federal government's power expands, it does not easily go back. In fact, it almost never goes back. And so this whole Common Core experience has legitimized a larger role of the federal government in education policy than before. Now, a lot of people could say, yes, No Child Left Behind was an expansion of federal responsibility, and in some ways it was. But this is more, and actually much more, if you think about it. What No Child Left Behind did, in essence, was require that everyone test and report results. That was what it did. Now, it said to every state, you decide what it is that you're testing, you decide how to teach it. All that we require is that you decide what it is that kids should learn, and test for it and tell us what the results are broken out by subgroup. It was an information provision requirement. Now, that is an expanded role of the federal government, and we can argue about whether that was good or bad, but it was in keeping with the role of the federal government since the Office of Education was founded in the 1860s, which was information provision. So the federal government has, for a century and a half, been involved in collecting information and reporting it about schools. Okay, so No Child Left Behind was mostly in keeping with that. but it was a much more extensive information collection. It's a bigger thing. But Common Core goes way beyond that, because it doesn't just say that you have to collect information and tell us what it is, but it tells states, school districts, schools, and teachers what to teach and how to teach it. Now I know that people will say there's a difference between standards and curriculum and pedagogy, and of course there is. But for standards to mean anything, for it to not be worthless words in a document, it has to drive curriculum and pedagogy. That's the theory of how it works. So if it works, it's a big expansion of what the federal government does. And the federal government has gotten involved now in telling states what their standards should be and how they're supposed to teach and what they're supposed to teach. Now they haven't done it directly, they didn't order it by law, but they coerced it, they pushed it, they incentivized it. We can quibble over which word you prefer, but they had a big hand in it. The other thing that's really corrosive to liberty is in Common Core is that it provides license to local educators and administrators to alter education in a way that in which they're not accountable to democratically or to parents. So one of the controversies related to Common Core is that the English standards appear to increase emphasis on informational text and a reduction in emphasis on literature. Now, the authors of Common Core say, no, you misunderstand. We're just talking about improving the quality of informational text outside of English class in social studies and science. But it doesn't matter what the authors of Common Core say it means. What matters is that local school officials are making changes, and they're saying Common Core is making us do it. Now, of course, it's really what they want to do. They're doing it because they want to do it, but they are not accountable for that decision because they're saying that they're acting on someone else's orders. Okay? So, in my school district, and I'm sure we have many other anecdotes of this, 9th grade English has eliminated several works of literature that they had been teaching for years. They eliminated Romeo and Juliet, Of Mice and Men, the Odyssey, gone. They're all gone. They've been replaced with informational text, including a self-help book, The 7 Secrets of Successful Students, or something like that. And it's a horror, right? I mean, to me, that's not at all what I want them to be doing. But I can't even get them to change because they say, oh, it wasn't us. We didn't do it. Common Core did it. But who is this faceless thing, Common Core? Who do I elect to change that? Who do I write to change that? What we've done is we've removed accountability for what's taught in 9th grade English from my 9th grade English teacher. I mean, if my 9th grade English teacher might have made a bad decision, but at least I could talk to her and try to convince her. But now she says it wasn't me, right? Or she points to the curriculum official in the school district, and the curriculum official says it wasn't me. And this is a really dangerous move because it's removing meaningful accountability from schools for the pedagogical and curricular choices that they're making. Reformers like the word accountability. So reformers like choice and they like accountability. What do they mean by accountability? So choice is accountability. It's accountability to families. But the thing that we usually call accountability is not that kind of accountability. It's a different kind of accountability. It's accountability to bureaucrats, right? So if the state requires a test, and if it makes people take it, that's not accountability to families. That's accountability to bureaucrats. There are state officials, we're going to get those results, and they do things with it, okay? So some people say, well, that's legitimate. It's supposed to be that way, because if there's government money there has to be government accountability. If the government pays for it, then you have to be accountable to the government for those monies that are spent. This argument is completely false. And it's not only, it's false, it's so obviously false that if people thought about it for a minute, they could think of a dozen government programs where monies are expended with no formal accountability required. So, for example, even in the area of education, the government subsidizes preschool and higher education and requires no testing accountability. Right? The government doesn't demand test scores from preschools or colleges in exchange for the government monies that are spent or subsidies that are provided. Now some people say, well, that's a mistake, we should correct that and require it, but I'm not sure we really want to go that way. But outside of education, we could think of the largest government programs are expenditures with no accountability for the use of the monies. So, for example, Social Security. Social Security, what is it there for? It's there to prevent people from being indigent in their later years, right? People who are maybe too old to work and recover from a financial shortfall. We want to make sure that as a respect for the elderly, that people are not indigent in their senior years, and so we provide a subsidy to ensure that people have enough money to obtain shelter and food and clothing. But there's no accountability demanded for that. We just write checks to people and we assume that they have the good sense to use it in the best way for themselves that they think. We don't demand an accounting of how they spent it on food and housing and clothing. For all we know, they went to the casino with it, right? And we don't monitor that. We just trust that seniors are going to use it to help themselves. And this is a giant program, Medicare. Similarly, we don't demand an accounting of how seniors use healthcare expenditures to maximize their health. We don't demand that they come in for government checkups to monitor the progress of their health, to ensure that in fact our monies are being used wisely by them in pursuit of maximizing their health. We don't demand that. We just provide them with essentially a voucher good for the medical care they choose to receive. And we don't demand any accountability from them beyond that. So it is simply false to say that government funds require government accountability. Government funds are to promote public purposes, and those public purposes could be achieved by trusting that people have it in their own interest to pursue the goals of the public purpose of those funds. So this issue has come up with the question of whether schools of choice ought to be included in formal accountability systems. Not choice accountability, but top-down testing accountability. So charter schools, private schools that participate in tax credit or voucher programs, there's a call that these schools should be taking the same test that all other schools in the state are required to take, so that we can be sure that the monies are being used for. I think that's completely mistaken. Now, let me be clear. If the only way you can get a bill passed to expand choice is to compromise and agree to a testing requirement, that may be a sensible compromise. But it is not an ideal. It's suboptimal to agree to it, because what is top-down accountability really for? Well, it's really a system of internal control. So a system will try to control itself because it can't have competition within itself. It will try to control itself through collecting of information and central accountability. So firms, for example, will collect information and mete out consequences internally because they don't have competition internally. So Coca-Cola, if they want to maximize sales, they may collect information about the sales of their individual salespeople, and they may provide bonuses, consequences, for the sales performance of their different salespeople. And that is a form of top-down accountability. But they're doing that in order to compete with Pepsi. Right? They're doing it internally to compete externally. It would be foolish for a public health official to say, all soda manufacturers should have the same accountability system so that we know that they're all performing well. Right? part of what's good about having each organization develop its own internal accountability system is that through the process of choice and competition, they have incentives to get their own accountability right. They want to get it right so that they improve their performance so that they win in competition against other organizations. So we don't want the public school system, which has to control itself, as long as there are going to be public schools, a system of government-operated schools, then it has to control itself somehow, and so it has to collect information on itself somehow. But there's no reason to impose that system on schools that are outside of government operation. Charters are outside of government operation. They are government funded, and they are government regulated, but they are not government operated. They are privately operated, for the most part. Similarly, private schools that participate in tax credit or voucher programs are outside of the government operating system. And the accountability that charters and private should be subject to is not top-down formal accountability, but the real accountability of choice by families. And I would just emphasize that it may be perfectly sensible to compromise, to expand choice, to agree to a testing requirement if that's the only way you can get the votes to pass something. But don't believe that your compromise is a virtue. Don't confuse the practical with the ideal. And I think a lot of reform organizations have had to accept these compromises several times, and then they begin to convince themselves that actually that's the ideal. And that when they begin negotiations the next time, they actually begin at the point of saying, okay, testing should be required. It should be a concession that you give later, if you have to. Reformers not only have been seduced by national standards and by dreams of top-down accountability, but they've also been led astray by a narrow vision of what education is for. And so let me start by saying what I think education is for. I think education is really just an extension of parenting. It's just part of what we do to prepare children for their adult lives. And maybe it's foolish, but human beings have come up with an arrangement in most parts of the globe for several millennia where the dominant arrangement is that the biological mother and father tend to make parenting decisions for their own children. Now, there could be other arrangements. We could have, communal child rearing. We could have children, raised by professionals. But that has not been the dominant arrangement, and probably with good reason. We have reason to believe that biological parents are properly incentivized to make reasonably good choices for their own children. They're going to make mistakes, no doubt. They're going to have limited information. But then again, so do well-meaning but distant bureaucrats. They're going to make mistakes too. And whose mistakes would you rather have made? I'd rather make my own mistakes than have someone else make mistakes on my behalf. So if that's what education is for, well then parents want lots of different things for their children in raising them to be adults. Yes, they want their children to have work-related skills. Yes, they want them to be employed and to live independently, right? I mean, parents generally want this, but they don't want just that. That's not all that education is to most parents. Most parents really care a lot about values. They care about what kinds of people their children become. And that's a big part of parenting, and it should be a big part of education. But by turning our children over to the government to be raised in a government-operated school, we have de-emphasized these value questions because we're uncomfortable having the government address values. But we've just removed from education a big part of what really needs to be there, which is the development of our children into the kinds of human beings that we wish them to be. Now, reformers have been problematic on this, in particular from the business community. So the business community says, look, my workers are lousy. I want better workers. I need the school system to produce better workers. So they really have put a big emphasis on improving work-related skills in schools. And this is part of why we've focused so heavily on testing in math and reading, because we think that these are kind of core work-related skills. But it's not just there, it goes beyond that. I mean, there are reform movements represented by 21st Century Skills, Tony Wagner. I don't know if any of this strikes you at all as familiar, but it's a whole reform movement that basically we should be changing school systems so that they're more relevant to employers. So rather than doing algebra, which most people will never need in the workforce, so says Tony Wagner, we should have them study statistics. And by the way, by statistics, it really means kind of read a pie chart. It doesn't really mean like run a t-test. So that's a narrowing of the vision of education as job training. So instead of literature, well, who really needs poetry for the workplace? Instead, we need to focus more on communication skills, collaborative skills, PowerPoint presentations. I can assure you that one thing that our children will not need in 10 years is PowerPoint. It's almost certainly the case that this technology will be replaced by something else. I have no idea what it will be. And I don't know how to train children for a technology that we haven't even developed yet. And so in fact, one of the perverse things of this narrow focus on work-related skills is that it will privilege existing employers over future employers. Employers who don't even exist yet. They don't even know what skills they're going to need from their workers yet. And so rather than saying the real point of school is to prepare kids for jobs, the real point is to prepare them to be good human beings, which includes being able to work, but it doesn't consist entirely of being able to